Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, and welcome to our webinar today, How to Leverage Contract Automation to Boost Revenue and to Reduce Risk. Colleagues are still joining the bridge today, so we'll give them just a few more seconds to settle down. And for those that don't know me, my name is Paul Branch. I'm Chief Networking Officer here at World Commerce and Contracting, and it's my absolute delight to be your host today. We have an action-packed, feature-rich presentation for you, bringing forward two experts in the field. So really interesting session to be had today. So I see that the attendees have leveled off a little. So again, welcome to our webinar today, How to Leverage Contract Automation to Boost Revenue and to Reduce Risk. It's my absolute pleasure to welcome to our stage today, Heather Drouin. Heather is staff attorney at BISSELL Homecare, and we'll be hearing from Heather in just a short tick to understand from her perspective how she has deployed successfully CLM technology into her organization. And colleague and partner for today, Myles Van Leuven. Hello again, Myles. Senior Director, Customer Success and Advocacy at Agiloft. Now, if you're familiar with our webinar series, this will be no news to you, but if you're new to the series, then welcome. You will notice that you've joined our webinar today with your line muted. That's so that we can maintain the quality of the recording. Yes, we are recording this session for playback purposes. That doesn't mean to say, though, that we don't want to hear from you. We most definitely do. As questions occur to you, please use that Q&A tab at the bottom of the screen there to pose as questions. I'll ask the questions that I can in the moment, and we'll quiz our experts as we're running through the material. Some of the more meaty questions, though, I will save those up to the end because we do have a Q&A session set up. So at the end of the session, you'll receive a link to this recording, and you'll also receive a copy of the slides so that you can peruse the material at your leisure. Okay, without further ado then, let's get into our subject matter. So let me set the scene. At World Commerce and Contracting, based on some of our most recent research, we have identified a number of friction points within the CLM process. Indeed, we've identified over 40 such points in the end-to-end process from evaluation through close. We see material issues in the approve, negotiate, and most importantly, in the manage phases of that CLM model. Not all of these friction points are necessarily bad, but they are a point of resistance, which reduces the deal velocity. Some may be good, but those that occur post-award typically erode value. That little bullet point there in the orange, 70% of the friction points have a root pre-award. Seems reasonable. Interestingly, though, 70% of their cost materializes post-award. So that a laser focus on pre-award is absolutely essential, but so too is that similar focus on post-award. And for many of our corporations, that obligations tracking, jeopardy management, risk and issues management, change management, dispute resolution, those post-award engagements are hugely important in order to maintain the value that exists in this contracting process. Just another bullet point for you. Based on our research, just a little under $7,000, that's the cost to get to a negotiated agreement for a relatively straightforward agreement. It's orders of magnitude greater than that from some of these more complex master services agreements that run over multiple years. So if we can save a fraction of that cost, multiplied by the number of times that we execute that process every year, the savings are material. So Myles, why don't you tell us a little bit about what Agiloft has been up to over the last few months, and then most importantly, that question about value. how you drive value out of good contract management. Over to you.
Yeah. Thanks, Paul. I appreciate the introduction. And that data is really interesting. It's, 70% of erosion happens, post-execution. And that's where, we're seeing a lot of companies focus on that as well, because they recognize that. For Agiloft, the last few months and really the last 2 years have been huge. So, and things are going really well for Agiloft. We got a growth equity investment in 2020 from FTV Capital, a $45 million round of funding, and we're doing a lot with that investment. We have a relatively, not really new anymore, but a relatively new CEO, Eric Laughlin, who was previously at Ernst & Young, Chief Revenue Officer, Kevin Niblock, who came from Zora and Aptus, and then also a Chief Product Officer, Andy Wishart, who was previously at Thomson Reuters. And speaking of Andy and the product management team, we had a big spring release with tons of new features, including a sourcing and supplier information management module that we'll talk a little bit on this call about. And then we're also looking forward to our second product release that will come later this year. So lots of big stuff happening at Agiloft, and we're seeing the product push forward, and our customer base is definitely growing.
Excellent, really good. So what about that question though about the value? What's the value that you can derive from good contract management, do you think?
Yeah, absolutely. I think if we go to the next slide, these are really the 4 areas that we see as we talk to customers, where they're really looking to get value and are getting value from a good CLM solution. So operational efficiencies, what customers and companies are looking for is to increase the pace of work from their staff, right? Increase collaboration amongst those who work on a contract, which, can be buy side in legal or sell side in legal, can be, across various functions. And so you want to break down those silos so that those teams can operate efficiently around the contract. Also, especially on the sell side, increasing revenue, that's all about faster deal velocity and getting deals done faster. And then visibility, right? This is about using data and real-time information to manage work. And then compliance is a final area where companies are looking to implement systems and processes that mitigate risk to the business, that provide needed controls, systems that can be audited to show that the company is compliant with regulations and other company policies. So we're happy to work with companies of all different shapes and sizes and to help them to realize this value. But these are some really common areas that they're looking to, and that's one of the reasons why I'm really excited to have this conversation with Heather from BISSELL Homecare. BISSELL is one of our newer customers, and they're a really good example of how a CLM solution has helped their organization become more efficient and have visibility to reduce risk and enhance their contracting process. So Heather, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, Myles. We are a relatively new customer of Agiloft. It's been a great onboarding process. BISSELL Homecare is an old family-owned company. We're in the 3rd generation of BISSELLs running it right now. And most of you probably have a BISSELL product somewhere in your home, a cleaning product, a formula of some kind. So we're a global company. We have offices and customers and consumers all over the world. And so we deal daily with China and Amsterdam, in the Middle East and Mexico. I've been with BISSELL for a little over 6 years now, and I'm a staff attorney on the contracts team. I mostly manage expenditure contracts, but I'm involved in all sorts of revenue contracts as well, but mostly expenditure. But they come in from all over the company. We don't have a central buying office. It's every associate. And we have a relatively small team. Since we're not a profit center, we keep our team lean. We have about 2,400 contracts that we know of, but we're certain others get signed and slip past us pre-Agiloft. So that was the best record keeping we could get. It was about 2,400 a year. We have about 3 people on the expenditure side, another 3 on the revenue side. And one of those people they do mostly administrative work. So, and that was really necessary pre-Agiloft because it was very manual. We had a process that involved Outlook to receive requests. We had a bulky Excel spreadsheet that was so delicate, I think one person could touch it. We had a SharePoint site for approvals, and then we had a repository with an e-signature function in it. So slow and hectic. It seems like an odd combination, but that's exactly what it was. It was bulky. It was confusing. Our internal customers were constantly complaining that they didn't understand the process and what came next and what did they do next. I thought we kept changing it. We didn't. They were just confused what it was. We'd had little oversight over our contracts. Expiration dates, monitoring those became difficult. And what precipitated this onboarding of Agiloft was a contract that auto-renewed for about $60,000 a year. Not a huge expense, but it did justify the expense of Agiloft. If we could avoid even one of those a year, Agiloft pays for itself. And it became very clear that we needed something. Our review process was about 3 to 10 days. Obviously, a larger agreement might take a little bit longer, but because it had to come through email and we had to sort our emails, it took a little bit of time to find what we were supposed to be looking at. And it kept all of us incredibly busy. We're still busy, but in different ways, and I think in more productive work.
I think if an observation, if I may, this reflects on the situation of many of our corporate members. You know, don't get me wrong, some are into second generation applications of artificial intelligence, so they're obviously leagues ahead. But maybe not the majority, but certainly a large minority of folks are in exactly the same position that you were in before you adopted this sort of technology.
Yeah, we thought we were the only ones. We were surprised to learn that most people were managing systems similar to ours.
Indeed. It creates a huge opportunity for corporations to leapfrog their competitors who are still in that position. Very good. Interesting. Can you tell us some more?
Sure. We initially saw a need for a CLM solution about 4 years ago, and we started looking at some options. They seemed too bulky, too expensive. We couldn't justify the cost. Finding the time to implement it was becoming a problem. We were so busy, we didn't know if we would be able to carve out the time. We also learned some of the stakeholders didn't know what a CLM was. They thought we had a CLM because we had a process, and they didn't see how the sausage was made. They saw the end product, they signed a contract, and they thought that was the end of it, and didn't see what went in before, and they don't see what goes in after they sign that contract. They just sign it and everything's done. About a year ago, we had a new general counsel come on board that saw the value of an actual CLM process all in one system instead of how we were doing it. And it just became necessary to change. BISSELL was growing, expanding. We had a lot of new associates, contracts coming in from everywhere. We had to find a way to wrangle things. And so we started the search coincidentally about 18 months ago. It wasn't because of the pandemic, but it happened to coincide with the pandemic. And like I've said, what was really important was seeing the full life cycle and seeing it all in one place to make it predictable for our internal customers so they could communicate with vendors, so they could communicate with suppliers. This is what will happen next. This is what they can expect. The visibility to the contract status, we were spending time answering the question, where's my contract at? Has someone looked at it? If I'm spending time to find their status, I'm not spending that time looking at their contract. It's not as valuable work. We don't need lawyers saying your contract is in approvals or your contract is out for signature. The users can see that directly themselves. Excuse me. We needed something that integrated with a reliable e-sign system, something that looked familiar to people when they got a request. And I believe Agiloft accommodates both Adobe Sign and DocuSign. So that was really important to have. Not just the legal department uses it. Every person can submit a contract through Agiloft in any department at BISSELL, but the accounts payable team also references it. to see if a contract is final, is it signed, is it approved before they're processing a PO. So we have some assurance that the ducks are in order before the next step happens. And we have the ability now to track every contract that comes in. It's a quick submission process. It was difficult to track an email before. We'd spend hours a day sorting emails, finding the last version, making sure we didn't miss anything. And when we did, that cost money. That cost people, a deadline to get a deal sometimes. But now when it's all visible right in front of us, it's really helpful.
So Heather, we've got a question here from Terry. What was legal's role in BISSELL for contract lifecycle management implementation versus, a more traditional supply chain or sales business type role?
Sure. Legal owns the contract process from beginning to end. The supply chain would submit a contract or a request, but it's 100% on the legal team from beginning to end. Implementing this was 100% on the legal team. And that was actually one of the pitfalls. Since we had owned the process before, we were kind of blinded to what other people might need outside our role. So if we did it again, I think earlier on, even pre-Agiloft, we would have involved outside people so they could see what we were doing. We could get a better idea of their needs, to see what they needed in the process would have been helpful. Although the feedback now that we have it implemented has been great. People are on board. But getting them involved sooner would have been helpful.
Yeah, what I've seen is that sort of stakeholder engagement is hugely important, and it comes to the table when you start to implement, because if folks have been involved in developing the solution, they're more likely to engage in delivering and implementing the result. So yeah, so certainly engaging stakeholders more sooner in the delivery. Yes. Would be something you would do differently.
Yeah.
Anything else that springs to mind?
We would have started sooner. We would have done this before. I don't think there was any difficulty doing it from home, but it's like a breath of fresh air. And it sounds weird saying this, but it's so much different being able to actually do productive work during the day rather than a lot of the administrative stuff was wearing me down personally. I don't want to spend all day chasing contracts if I can actually turn around productive work. We would have done it much sooner. Right.
One of the things that occurred to me also perhaps was, because if I have this right, you really apply the technology pre-award, taking you up to the negotiation of the contract. Do you think there's an opportunity to deploy the same technology post-award for management?
Definitely. And we haven't had that oversight before. It just went into a repository, the contract did, and that's where it sat. And maybe somebody would mark on their calendar when it expired, and we would track that, but that was it. It's no different than throwing it in a filing cabinet and forgetting about it. There's a lot of value in tracking some of those deliverable dates, just tracking some of that stuff afterwards, someone being aware of deadlines and when deliverables are expected. That oversight is invaluable.
Totally agree. Scott has a question here regarding your legacy contracts. Did you import the legacy contracts? And if you did you find value in terms of using it as a repository for search and management and perhaps change management around those older contracts?
Yeah, we kind of did a hybrid of it. We had a repository and we moved a portion of the active contracts is what we actually moved into Agiloft. So we don't have a lot of expired legacy contracts in there. And what we only moved the bare minimum of metadata with it. So we don't have a lot of tracking ability with the legacy contracts, but that seemed like to strike the right balance of not overwhelming. It would have been a little overwhelming of a process to gather that metadata, to break it out and to put it into Agiloft. just because we hadn't had a good record-keeping system previously. That might be different if we had been tracking that metadata previously and could pull it over. And so we maintain 2 systems right now a little bit. The other one is just a repository. We can go look for it. If we need to bring something over, it takes 2 minutes, if that, to bring it into Agiloft. But yeah, there would be definite value to it if we had saved some of that metadata to begin with.
So Myles, do you see that with a lot of your other customers where they have this sort of pragmatic approach from what Heather described, where you bring over some and leave some?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I think what companies do is they do, like Heather was talking about, a cost benefit analysis. You know, how much data do we have? How valuable is it? And if it's going to be relatively easy to migrate that into Agiloft, then they do that. And if the costs are going to be high, maybe they would need to do a bunch of administrative work to clean up the data. And they also feel like maybe that data long-term doesn't add a lot of value, then they would retain their legacy system and only convert over what's really necessary on a moving forward basis. That's very, very common.
Makes total sense. Okay, great. Okay, Heather, keep going. This is great stuff.
Sure. When we were searching, these were our priorities. We really needed something that we could implement relatively quickly. We didn't want to spend a lot of time doing this, but that it could grow with the company, that there were other modules, options. There was different ways to reconfigure it later if we need to add options. The implementation was pretty quick, 2 to 3 months. We didn't have a lot of time to spend on it. One of our colleagues was going on maternity leave, and we knew we had babies don't wait till contract lifecycle management solutions are in place. So this one did, coincidentally, but we wanted to be finished before she left because we did not have the ability to add headcount. We had somebody filling in for her while she was gone, but we weren't going to be able to replace her and have another person come on. This one matched our current process, though it was bulky, really similarly. It still had the intake, it had the review and negotiation, it had an approval option and a repository, e-signature and then repository. So the highlights of it were very similar. We did not have to change any of that and disrupt business in that sense. We thought we needed an app. We liked the idea of an app and looking at your phone and doing it. And Agiloft does not have an app. We've realized now that we didn't need one, that the web-based version is plenty. It works fine. It works how it should work. And an app would just be unnecessary. We did have an IT project manager on the project who helped set up the single sign-on, so now it's accessible to everybody in the organization with one click, very simple to get on. Nobody has to remember passwords and links and all of that kind of stuff. So that was an important part of the integration. To have an IT project manager was helpful. And that it does have an open API to integrate with our supplier system. That is not part of, we don't have any current plans to do that, but that ability to do it, I think, is in the next phase. So we were looking at the current needs and future needs. And Agiloft seemed to fit all of those.
Stephen has a killer question here. Did you have any pushback from your internal IT folks regarding time to implement the new system, that other priorities take the lion's share? And if so, how did you address that pushback?
We did not have any pushback from that because the only resource it was the IT project manager and implementing the single sign-on. Because we didn't have to, it's not hosted at BISSELL. It didn't involve our IT systems otherwise. But he was helpful in, translating some IT language for us. That's what this means, and that's what this means. There was a little bit of pushback from stakeholders because the legal team doesn't make money and we were spending money. So the real hurdle was showing the value in this and why our time was important to focus on this for benefits down the road.
But 160K auto renewal that shouldn't have auto renewed was
exactly. We just reminded them of that. If we could avoid that and how we were setting this up to avoid that.
Right. Probably got what time for one, maybe just one more question, and then we'll hand over to you, Myles. The looking at the pre-work, how much pre-work did you complete prior to working with Agiloft? Did you do a lot of requirements capture and process mapping? And if so, how did you go about doing that? And did it take very long?
No, it didn't take long at all. Our process was bulky but relatively simple, and since it was so manual, there were none of those processes that need to be put into Agiloft. The mapping was pretty simple. It was all part of the implementation, and it was broken down into bite-sized pieces. Now we'll work on this. Now we'll work on this. And so it was, I think we had twice a week meetings during the implementation where we did the work. But the pre-work, no, there wasn't a lot of that. We did have to look at how many users we had, how many internal clients we had, a list of those. We did have that immense spreadsheet that we took what we could out of it. You know, how many contracts did we do? Who were our most frequent customers, internal customers? Where were most of the contracts? Were they on the spend side or the revenue side? But other than that, there wasn't a whole lot of pre-work that we needed to do.
Interesting. Yeah, I think having that legacy spreadsheet helped you to order your thoughts, would be my expectation. Sure. Okay, I said no more questions, but there's one here from Bob. I just can't resist. So, has BISSELL reaped any previously unknown gems of knowledge from loading the legacy contracts into Agiloft?
Interesting. What we loaded in were mostly master agreements. We didn't load statements of work or the sub agreements in. So from the master services agreements, mostly what we loaded in, we got a better idea of what was actually active, what wasn't active, what people were using. And because we didn't load everything in, we still get requests occasionally. So now we know what contracts people are using. Sometimes you sign a master agreement, you have one statement of work there, and it sits there forever and nobody touches it again. So we are looking at a year after we've migrated things to go back and look at our repository to see what's actually active. If nobody's touching it in years, that's a sign that we need to take a look at it, that maybe it needs to be terminated or somebody needs to be alerted that it exists. We had relationships some people didn't know existed.
Right.
So that's been helpful.
Okay.
And I did see a question. Did you want to touch on the one about the clause library and templates, or do we have a minute for that?
Sure. Go for it.
Yeah, we haven't built out our clause library yet, but the fact that we have the ability to do that was one of the selling points. That clause library has been important. And then we have right now a handful of templates in there, commonly used templates, and they were relatively easy to do. It was part of the implementation process. And we have the ability to do those ourselves now. We don't go to tech support to do new templates. We have the ability to load those, change them, and do them on the fly.
Yeah, Karen, thank you for your question. Yeah, I think with clause libraries particularly, the movement away from standard templates to those that are more on a clause library with fallback provisions and business logic around those, that's certainly where many of our members are heading if they're not already there. So I commend that as well. Okay, really interesting. Thank you. Okay, so let's take a quick look then at what the tool looks like day to day for you then, Heather.
Sure, there's a dashboard that comes up that's personalized to each user who logs on, which has useful information. Every widget has useful information. You see a lot of dashboards and they look pretty, but you don't know what any of it means or why you're seeing it. The dashboards are customizable, so each of us sees what we need to see. And that status bar at the top, the draft pending CM as contract manager, pending approval, has been invaluable to our internal customers. They can look real simply. They click into their contract. They know whether it's approved or pending approval, who has it. That status right there will tell them who needs to do the work. So it's to see that stuff right up front. Previously, people would just email a contract and say, here's a contract, and we would get no information with it. So there was a lot of back and forth with our internal customers. Now with the intake form, they answer all the questions up front, and we can quickly delegate who reviews it, what needs to be done. All the steps in it are really simple to do. Picking out what template people need to use is really simple. The revenue team has a separate workflow for their contracts. They gather a little bit different information than we do for expenditure. And they've been able to manage a parallel system with us implemented at the same time. So someone had a question about addendums, extensions of contracts, tracking the revisions. There's version control that has been life-changing. Before, we were searching through emails, sorting by the latest date, and I had to assume that was the most recent version that we were going with. Now I see the version control. Previous ones are superseded. I can click on the previous ones if I want to see the changes. Addendums are easy to add to the record if there's an addendum. Other documents that might go along with a contract are all part of the record, and they're easy to upload, easy to approve. It's all in one place.
Do the in-life changes come back to you for approval? So you know, to Abdul's point, if you were doing contract changes, material changes to the form, they would come back and you would store those in Agiloft as well. Is that how that works?
Correct. Yeah. Change orders come through here, but if it's pre-signature, the versions go back and forth. We ask that our internal customers work directly with the vendor. But legal does have oversight over those at any time. We can look at the changes. We can weigh in on them. We can be behind the scenes. You don't always want to say, my lawyer's going to look at this, or I have to send this to legal. They don't need to explicitly loop us in, but we have visibility to the contract.
Very good.
And this is a kind of neat slide that we've used internally for our stakeholders, because it breaks out the process. That process is really what we had all along. The middle section was our process, but now all these other features that we were able to add all along. And I should say our other process ended at repository. We didn't have reporting capabilities before, beyond saying we've done 2,400 contracts or 1,800 of them were expenditure contracts. There is so much more that we can do now. Even for the time to approve, we can go to an approver and say your approvers are taking a little long, or you're holding up expenditure contracts, or why does it take you so long to do revenue contracts? We can pinpoint where there's friction in the process, where there's some stalls and why there are, where we didn't have that before. Just looking at emails doesn't give you all this information. But to have all these features along the way, they were all important to us, choosing the CLM, and we've seen all of these benefits in Agiloft.
My expectation would be that reporting, because clearly it's pre-award through approval and execution, post-award, beyond reporting. I think you're going to see opportunities to deploy this into, you know, the post-award areas, obligations tracking, jeopardy management, risk and issue, you know, those things we talked about at the beginning, change, dispute resolution. I think that's going to add another level of sophistication to your ability to manage your contracts in life that your teams outside of legal are really going to appreciate. Same deal in terms of the implementation, though. You need to engage them as stakeholders, as you did for that initial deployment. Really interesting. Yeah, it's a very thought-provoking chart, that one. So results and benefits then.
Yes, the visibility into the contract status. Our approvers before, some of them weren't aware of a contract until they were asked to approve it. And so that's a little late in the game, and it stalls things. They have visibility way before that now, and they can see the process as it's happening. They can see the negotiations. They can weigh in on them. So for every level of the organization, being able to see a status, see where a contract is at, and get involved has been helpful. Reducing the risk. We know where our contracts are. We know when they expire. somebody gets an alert. It's on their dashboard every time they log in. They have a contract expiring soon. Nobody can say that they've missed that because it's always available. We have recently brought China into the system. They're using it. I've talked to our team in Mexico about them using it. They use it in Amsterdam with no problems. I have not heard any complaints of anybody not understanding the process. We've trained them just through videos, through written tutorials, and they are using it just fine with no problems. The contract's turnaround time has improved considerably. I look at every contract I get within 24 hours. I put eyes on it, and I can make a note of the next steps. And that helps me prioritize contracts. I can reassure my customers that their contract was looked at the day I got it. As soon as it's assigned to me, there's eyes on it. They didn't always have that with email. They didn't know where it went after they emailed a mailbox. And so now it gets looked at quickly. We do an incredible amount of contracts a day. I did 5 one day last week. It was a rush day, and I just sat down and powered through them and moved through them quickly because I didn't have to do administrative work. Over the last 3 months, while my colleague was on maternity leave, and we did have someone sitting in her seat doing the work, we processed 150 more contracts this summer than we did last summer without adding headcount. And I don't think there's any intent to add headcount, so we're going to keep at this pace. Summer's normally our slowest time for contracts. So we're expecting it to be really busy at the end of the year, and it will be manageable this year. Last year, it was barely manageable. This year, I think it'll be much, much easier. When I set out my goals for the year, one of them was to have 50% of our internal clients using Agiloft by the fourth quarter. Before the third quarter, we had 100% of our internal clients using it. We have just pushed everybody to using it to have one system, no more emails, email requests for contracts. And it's really worked well to have one system and everybody on it. And people are getting the hang of it now. I think we might have been June 1st when we went live. And we've been really graceful with people over the summer, giving them a lot of grace, let them get used to the system, and they've adopted it well.
Right. Just before we move to our poll, quick question. How are contracts assigned? Do they go to a central email address and are then piped out to the relevant attorney, or is it done, first come, first served? How is that done within the tool?
Yeah, a little bit of a combination. They all come into Agiloft. We have an administrator who can look at the intake sheet, and she can handle some of them. For the ones that aren't her responsibility, she assigns a member of the legal team to review. Alternatively, we get emails when a new contract is submitted. All of the contract managers do, and we can grab them whenever we want. So I try to do that. If I see an email come through, I go into the record, put my name on it. Now it's mine. And so it's a combination of an administrator, and we grab what we should.
Right. So triage, and then you work stack manage based on a capability. That's
yep.
a very smart way to do it. Great question. Thank you. Okay, so time for our poll then. So you've heard some great themes from Heather today. And our question to you is, which of those themes resonated with you? Was it the theme about gain of visibility in contract status, the issue we're just talking about? Was it improving renewal and turnaround around process and driving the velocity? Was it mitigating risk to the organization? Unwanted renewals was just one of those examples. Was it getting stakeholder buy-in for CLM? Or was it basically a combination of all of those things that resonated with you? So if you could please express a vote on that, and Emma, when the numbers stabilize a little, perhaps if you could close the poll, and then let's take a look at the results. So we're looking for the themes that resonated most with you. So it'd be interesting to see we were chatting about where we thought this would land, and I think we're about to find out. Yeah, nearly 60% said it's all of those things. So 57% were all the above. Those that expressed an individual preference were, almost equally split around improving renewal, turnaround process, and mitigating risk to organization. Yeah, that was basically what I had expected. What about you, Myles? What do you think on that?
Yeah, I mean, totally. I think Heather's talked about a lot of different areas where they were able to get value, and I think that's why all of the above was the most selected. But also, like, I think two things that are on people's minds are, how do we speed up our processes? How do we get deals done faster?
Yeah.
And then also in the process of doing that, how do we do it in a safe way that's going to ultimately mitigate risk to the organization?
Totally. Heather, any observations on that? I think that's
one of our priorities was balancing the risk with speed and finding an appropriate way to do that. And I think the process we've set up worked well in Agiloft.
Right. We've got a couple more questions from Carolyn from KP. We'll get to those, I promise, but let's keep going. So next steps, what's going to happen next in BISSELL?
Yeah, we've had some requests to set up teams so a manager could see their team's contracts and see how they work together, make sure there's no duplicates, to see their spend, to get control over what their team is doing, to have oversight over that. Automation to save time, I think, will probably be our next step. We have templates. If the risk is low to BISSELL because they're on our templates, there's no change to anything, that perhaps they can skip a step in our process. Maybe the legal approval isn't necessary or a legal review, and that users can go directly through Agiloft themselves. Customizing homepage. I think we're going to start offering short sessions to our internal users to make their homepage work for them, because we know the abilities are there, to show them how to set up their widgets so they're seeing the information they need. There's been talk of when we do our due diligence on new suppliers or new vendors, incorporating that process into Agiloft or finding a way to do it within Agiloft has been important. So we can pre-screen a company before they're active, before they have the green light to have contracts. So some of those things like a Dun & Bradstreet report or doing a sanctions watch list.
Right.
Do we have a certificate of insurance from them? That background work has been really important. And I think that's, I intend to work with a different team than the legal team at BISSELL to incorporate that.
Understood. Great. Thank you, Heather. That's really interesting. Myles, back to you, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the things that resonates with me on these last couple bullets of what Heather talked about was managing suppliers and the information around suppliers. And so as we were preparing for this conversation, we thought, hey, let's double click on that and go a little deeper. So I'm going to talk about supplier information management and sourcing events and go a little deeper there. But before I do, I just want to take a quick step back and talk about, CLM, and then what are all the adjacencies to a contract lifecycle management. If you think about the functions in a business that are going to be really interested in contract lifecycle management, on the sell side, you've got lead to cash. On the buy side, you've got, source to pay, you got the procurement teams, and then you've got the legal team as well. And so there are all these, CLM, contract lifecycle management, sits in the center, but then there are all these other solutions that these teams use that are sort of adjacent to contract lifecycle management. And if you look at, before you have a contract, you might have an RFP, where you go out to various vendors and gather information from them. And then when you have a new vendor, you need to manage that supplier information that they would provide and do the due diligence. And so all of that information that you would gather in those processes can be really valuable to feed into your contract lifecycle management solution. So as we go to the next slide, as we've been talking to our customers and specifically sourcing professionals and understanding the challenges that they're going through, what we see is that there are some real challenges right now for sourcing professionals. There's pressure to consolidate suppliers, to use less suppliers, and the way to do that is with visibility into who all those suppliers are and the work that they're doing. At the same time, there are complex sort of manual processes, and there really aren't great tools out there for many sourcing professionals. There's also a lot of pressure to optimize spend to get the most value from the dollars that are being spent by the business. And then also making sure that there's quality and that the suppliers are complying with company policies and meeting regulatory requirements. And then finally, with a lack of good systems, you end up with data in all sorts of places. I took some notes when Heather was talking before about pre-CLM, how they were doing things in Outlook and email and SharePoint and e-signature. Stakeholders didn't understand the process and were frustrated. That's for the contract lifecycle management. But that same sort of environment exists often when it comes to supplier information management and sourcing events like RFPs. So what we've built with Agiloft is an extension off of the CLM platform and sourcing and supplier information management module. And so as we go to the next slide here, this is just a little deep dive on sort of how these modules work. So on the sourcing management module, you can create a sourcing event like an RFP, and then there's workflow associated with that, right? There need to be approvals. There needs to be RFP needs to be sent out to all of the suppliers, and then they would submit their proposals, and then you would evaluate and then approve the vendor that you're going to use. And then once you have that vendor, then doing all the due diligence and gathering the information about that supplier so that you can ensure that they're an approved vendor for the business. And then finally, we get into contract lifecycle management, which we've spent the bulk of this conversation talking about. But throughout this process, having tools dedicated to each phase in the process and then having that information feed into your contract lifecycle management can be incredibly valuable. So we launched this sourcing and supplier information management, these tools, earlier this year, and we've seen that they're really well received by our customers. In fact, Heather, as we've been talking, I know this is the next step for you is to look at how these solutions can help BISSELL. Moving to go ahead, Paul. Did you have a question?
No, I was saying very good. It'd be good to see what they look like, though, Myles, if you have a slide.
Yeah, absolutely. So here's just a quick, you can see this looks very similar to some of the other Agiloft screenshots if you've taken a look at Agiloft or if you're an Agiloft customer. But this can all be configured. Basically, we have templates that users can start with. This is an example of how a sourcing analyst would create a sourcing event. So create a new RFP, right? And you don't see the full screen here in from the environment that we took the screenshot from. But you can basically configure all the metadata elements that you want. And you can have a template that you use to create the RFP, or if you create the RFP outside of Agiloft, you can upload it here and then have that reviewed within the company. And then as we go to the next slide, this is actually where you, like a sourcing manager would review that and then approve it to be sent out to vendors. So this is, again, a situation where it's a request for proposal, and you'll see in the middle of the screen here, there's a field publicity level, open or invitation only. So open would be, any vendors that the company uses would have the opportunity to submit a proposal, or you could go invitation only and have a select number of vendors who would have access to this RFP and be able to submit a proposal. So, we've thought through the various stakeholders that are involved in the sourcing event, and what are the views that they need to have in order to approve and review submissions and then make that selection. on a sourcing event like an RFP.
So Myles, how does that communication work between BISSELL and their potential supplier?
Yeah.
Email or what?
Yeah. So the communication. So the sourcing and supplier information management module will communicate to those suppliers via email, but it's going to redirect them to submit the information into the Agiloft module that's being used, right? So whether it's a contract, lifecycle management situation or a sourcing event like an RFP, the communications are going to happen through email, but where we want to gather the data is actually in Agiloft versus having somebody reply back with an email and using email as the communication mechanism.
Very good. Very good. So the initial email goes out, and then the data is then loaded. Their response and the response to the RFP is then loaded directly into Agiloft for further evaluation. Got it. Very good. Very good. Well, congratulations. It's certainly an interesting new feature to your portfolio. So congratulations.
Yeah, no, and I think this is certainly very interesting, and then also bigger picture, you can see with Agiloft with how flexible the platform is. Really we're building all sorts of solutions, continuing to focus on being a great CLM provider, but building also other solutions adjacent to that, so that we can meet needs sort of that connect to but go beyond CLM.
Right. Okay. Thank you, Myles. Thank you, Heather. Now we're going to go into our Q&A session. We have some questions teed up already. Feel free to use that Q&A tab if you'd like to pose us questions to our expert panel here. But Heather, this one's for you. It's from Carolyn. So for editing, when you're in the tool itself, is there a checkout, check-in process? Do you edit directly in the system, or do you work in another tool? So you can work in Word, for example, Word plugin, and then automatically talks into Agiloft. Talk us through that. How does that work?
Yeah, when you go into the record and you go into the attachments and you click on one, you get an option where you can just view it. You can edit it, but then it's not saved back in the system. And then there's a checkout and edit option. And so you click checkout and edit, and it opens up in Word. You make your edits, your red lines, whatever edits you need to make. You click save, and it automatically goes back into Agiloft. The new version is there. The previous version is superseded, and it's kind of grayed out. You can still click on it and see it, and you could make it active again, the superseded one, if you want to go back to a previous version. But your new version is automatically captured. It's been great for not having to keep track of which is the last one I worked on. So I can work on a contract for 10, 15 minutes, save it, walk away, come back, and pick up right where I left off.
Very interesting. Very interesting. Thank you. Okay, so KP asks, how do you track this? This goes back to the management of the workflow into the legal team. How do you track that queue? If someone wants a contract reviewed urgently and they want a queue jump, how do you allow that? Is there a ticket that's assigned, or how does that process work?
Sure. Yeah. Every contract has a contract ID number, and they're sequential. So someone can see that their number is higher than other numbers. We've asked people to name drop if they need to. If there's someone high up in the company that wants something, if Mark Bissell said to get a contract done, we've asked them to name drop in the record, put it in the notes, let the legal team know that it's a priority. We have one project here at Bissell that's a priority right now. We've asked that team to put those keywords in their record, and when we see those, the administrator or a legal person immediately checks on those. And so they do get to line jump. And line jumping is kind of weird because we really prioritize contracts on what time do I have in my schedule for this? Will this take me 5 minutes? Will this take me an hour? So I might look at one that came in right now because it'll take me 5 minutes, but one that came in yesterday, I'm going to schedule for this afternoon for an hour or two. So we prioritize based on that, but we ask people to give us a hint in the record why they need the line jump.
Right, as to the urgency, the need for the urgency. That's smart. So Myles, this one's coming to you. When we were talking about templates and the active clause library, can the system include both of those? Can you use templates and a clause library together? And then KP's question then goes into, can non-lawyers access this system to put together the original draft for review? So that self-service component that Heather mentioned, is that something that the tool can support organically?
Yeah. So as Heather talked about before, so they're using templates now, but plan to use a clause library potentially in the future. And that's pretty common, right? It just depends on how dynamic the contract assembly process is. If it's super dynamic and you need to pull different clauses together, then the clause library might be a better way to do that than a template. Yeah. In terms of the second part of the question, remind me again what the second part of that question was.
So it's about self-service.
Self-service, that's right.
Can folks, non-lawyers, put the contracts together?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's a trend that a lot of companies are going to, right? Which is, well, there are certain legal terms that need to be negotiated and reviewed by the legal team. But if they're standard business terms that are within the discretion of, non-attorneys, then let's enable those people to make those decisions. Totally. And self-service as much as possible, because the legal resources are expensive for the business. And so you want to focus those resources on really reviewing the things that legal needs to look at versus having them review everything.
Right. And if you have a thought through flowchart, decision tree, you're not taking on any additional risk because the legal team have already reviewed the flowchart and said, yeah, this is how we need to do it for this sort of engagement. This is the sort of fallback provision that would be acceptable to us as a legal team. And provided there's the audit trail that shows that you went through a business logic to get to that point, and there is absolutely no point, to your point, Myles, to go to a legal team for ask for concurrence because they've already given it. Yeah, we're seeing a lot of engagement in that sort of self-service model where you can, because of course the sales and procurement teams, they just love it because they are in control. They can generate a contract as fast as they need to, really. Now, clearly, you have to have a model for exception handling, because if you want to go out of a derogation against trading policy or whatever it might be and do something new, then you need to have an ability to then call out to your legal team for their support concurrence. So you need a bit of both. Good question. Thank you, Karen. Heather, I think that we've got a question here about obligations tracking. Now, since you implemented post-award, I think I'm going to direct this one to you, Myles, if I can. Is it possible to track contractual obligations that come up in contracts? Do you collect metadata for all of the different types of obligation, time-bound, triggered, unbound, those sorts of things, or is it more general than that? How do you go about doing obligations tracking in the tool?
Yeah, I mean, if there are standard obligations that go across contracts, right, you can have sort of a standard template that you would use to track those. But if it's a unique contract and, you need to collect, it has specific obligations in the contract, then you would create specific metadata elements, with reminders and those sorts of things for those obligations.
So you can calendarize it so that it generates alerts, sufficiently far out so that you can have time to respond and those sorts of things.
Exactly.
Right. Interesting question here from Alexandra. In terms of, is Agiloft really aimed at business to business or business to consumer type customers?
Yeah, I think, yeah. I mean, it can be both types, right? But in terms of the contracts that are being managed in Agiloft, those tend to be business to business contracts. Indeed. Versus business to a consumer type of contract, right?
And you have Agiloft customers globally, and you certainly have Agiloft customers in Europe.
Yeah, absolutely.
Obviously, but you have a capability to deliver services, and that's the advantage of a cloud-based platform, not just Agiloft, but many of the CLM vendors now are offering cloud-based solutions. It's very few folks that I'm working with now that actually have an on-premise CLM tool. It tends to be the legacy ones, and they're keen to move off because the operating costs of a cloud-based platform are materially less. So, you know, that's certainly where the industry seems to be moving. Well, where on earth did the time go? I always say that, but then great discussion, guys. Really, really interesting to hear from our expert, Heather. And Myles, thank you for sharing how Agiloft has resolved material business issues for BISSELL. Really interesting session today. Thank you guys. And thank you to our audience too for your great questions and for your engagement today. These webinars would be for nothing if it wasn't for you, our audience. And thank you for the positive feedback that you share around this webinar series. Thanks to our partner today, to Agiloft, for bringing together both Heather's expertise and also what's the latest and greatest happening in your organization. And all remains for me to do is to say thank you very much for your time, and please do enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you very much.